Hey, thank you. Thank you so much to the ARC of NEPA for having me. And thank you to all of you for attending. So today we're going to be talking about student anxiety and the extent of school district and charter school obligations under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and Section 504. Before we get into the slides, sort of a general theme I want to talk about is anxiety is one of those disabilities that I think we can all agree is not as clear cut as some of the other disabilities that fall under the IDA or Section 504. So, for example, something like a specific learning disability, where we have a more clear cut standard, a discrepancy between cognitive abilities and academic achievement, is it makes it where we can understand when a student has a specific learning disability a little more clearly than if a student has anxiety and how is that impacting the student educationally. So anxiety, I think, as we're going to go through this, there's several different factors that we have to consider, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to handle different things. But we're going to review a lot of hearing officer decisions and how they have interpreted some of the things that have happened with regard to students with anxiety, absenteeism, whether there's red flags regarding anxiety. But the common overall theme that I think we're going to hear is that if a school district or charter school is made aware of a student's anxiety and addresses it to some extent, they're going to be less likely to be held liable for denial of a free appropriate public education. Whereas if a student's anxiety is made aware by the district or charter school and it's not addressed, the district essentially doesn't do anything to address the anxiety, they're going to be more likely to be found liable for a denial of a free appropriate public education. So moving into in terms of identification of a student with anxiety under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDA, there are typically two eligibility categories, where a student with anxiety will likely fall if they are identified as having a disability under the IDA. The first would be emotional disturbance, and that is a condition where one or more of the following, and we're going to talk about these. One of the more following conditions that adversely affects the student's educational performance for a significant period of time and to a marked degree. So you only have to have one of these factors, not all of them, but it has to be adversely impacting the student's educational performance. Now, does that mean it has to be adversely impacting their academic performance? No, not necessarily. And we'll talk a little bit about how that pans out in the case law. But education, as we know, is not just academics, it's social progress, emotional progress as well. So it does have to impact the student for a significant period of time, and we're going to hear a little bit about that, and to a marked degree. So, inability to learn. If the student is demonstrating an inability to learn, it's not due to intellectual, sensory, or health factors, then they could be identified as a student. They would be identified as a student with emotional disturbance if it meets these other factors. If there are interpersonal relationship difficulties, so the student is struggling to build or maintain satisfactory relationships with either peers or teachers, and that's happening over a significant period of time to a marked degree and adversely impacting their educational performance, they would be identified with emotional disturbance. If the student is exhibiting behaviors or feelings that are inappropriate under normal circumstances, again, adversely impacting the educational performance for a significant period of time and to a marked degree, that's another factor that would qualify a student with emotional disturbance. General unhappiness, so a general or persistent mood of unhappiness or depression, again, adversely impacting the student's educational performance for a significant period of time and to a marked degree. And then finally, if a student is demonstrating physical symptoms, so a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. I think we often see this pop up with students with anxiety. There's a lot of those somatic complaints. And again, if it's adversely impacting the student's educational performance for a significant period of time and to a marked degree. So the second eligibility category is other health impairment that typically a student with anxiety may fall under. And this is a chronic or acute health condition that significantly limits a student's strength, vitality, or alertness. And again, it has to be adversely affecting the student's educational performance for the student to qualify under the IDEA. Now, other health impairment could be a variety of other disabilities may fall under that. We often see attention deficit hyperactivity disorder falling under that. But as the IDEA points out, it can be a variety of different disabilities: diabetes, epilepsy, heart conditions, leukemia, and anxiety disorders. So you may see a student identified with other health impairment by virtue of their anxiety disorder, and that's how they would qualify for services under the IDEA. I want to talk a little bit about the increasing attention to anxiety issues. I think probably a lot of us are experiencing that there seems to be an increase in students with anxiety. I don't know if it has to do with COVID. I don't know if it has to do with the increasing demands of our society. I don't know if there's a whole lot of factors that could be contributing, but there does seem to be an increase in students identified with having issues related to anxiety. These cases on this slide that we're going to compare are going back a little bit. And this is really when things first started to, hearing officers started to pay more attention to students with anxiety. The first case is JB versus Quakertown Community School District. And in this case, despite that, there was acknowledgement that the student had anxiety. So the district was aware, they acknowledged it. The hearing officer found that because that anxiety lessened as the teachers became more familiar with the student, and I think very importantly that the district did provide some counseling to the student. In this case, the hearing officer deemed that the district was not liable for a denial of a free appropriate public education. And again, I think it had a lot to do with that the district was doing something to address it. So they had an IEP for the student, and they were providing counseling services to the student. Contrast that with TH versus Pleasant Valley School District, where in that case, the district was essentially excoriated by the hearing officer for failing to address the student's anxiety, which caused absenteeism. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of the language, and this is just a little tiny piece, but the hearing officer found that after she had completed a thorough analysis of the student's IEP, that it was obvious that even if the student had attended school with few or no absences, so the district's argument in this case was, well, we can't address the student's anxiety because they're not coming to school. How can we address anxiety or anything if the student's not coming to school? Now, obviously, the student's anxiety was impeding their ability to come to school. But in this case, the hearing officer didn't really even address that. The hearing officer said because the IEP that was offered by the district was so poor that it wouldn't have mattered. And essentially, here's what she said. She said, it would have made no difference to the student's opportunity for meaningful progress because the IEP was so fundamentally flawed and inadequate and so utterly lacking in sufficient appropriate supports and services with respect to both academic instruction and social skills development that the student's absence was essentially a non-issue. So in that case, the student was deemed, excuse me, the student was the districts rather was deemed to be liable for the student's denial of a free appropriate public education. And in that case, actually the hearing officer ordered a great deal of compensatory education to the student. He was awarded 6 hours a day for the entire time that was at issue. So I want to talk a little bit about the types of anxiety. And as we go through these, we'll touch on some case law along the way. So generalized anxiety disorder is chronic anxiety, exaggerated worry and tension, even when there is little or nothing to provoke it. So this is I believe the most common form of anxiety that we'll see. Students are who are diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. There's nothing specific. So as we're going to see with the other types of anxiety, there's something more specific that's related. But this is when a student is just presenting with anxiety. Obsessive compulsive disorder is also a type of anxiety. And that involves recurrent unwanted thoughts, which are the obsessions, and then the repetitive behaviors, which are the compulsions. So the repetitive behaviors, and these are just examples, could be hand washing, counting, checking, cleaning. They're performed in the hope of preventing those obsessive thoughts. And essentially, the person's trying to make them go away. So they're performing these so-called rituals that offer temporarily relief, but they're not performing them markedly increases anxiety. So when we look at one example of this, we have MD versus Central Bucks. In that case, the student had significant symptoms of OCD. And in this case, the hearing officer really empathized with both the student and the student's family, as well as the school district. So again, this, did the district do anything? In this case, the hearing officer found that both the student and the district the student's mother and the district were working really hard. The staff on the district, the hearing officer found, could not cure the OCD. And she pointed out that even though this student had been in years of therapy for his OCD outside of school, sometimes hour-long sessions per week, that there was no cure for the OCD. But it's essentially, was it addressed? Was it was there things put in place to help the student with the underlying anxiety due to the OCD? So one interesting piece is the private evaluator in this case recommended that in order for the student to be provided with a free appropriate public education, the district must provide the student with cognitive behavioral therapy in school for several hours a week. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy is fantastic for students with anxiety, many students with anxiety, but the hearing officer in this case found that that was not, that was beyond the reasonable accommodations and what we call, quote, the floor of opportunity that the educational system must provide. So the hearing officer found that that was not something that a school district needed to provide. The school district, the hearing officer did note that the school district did provide an extensive amount of support to the student. So for example, first, the student was initially on a 504 plan, and then an IEP was eventually offered to the student. When the student was on a 504 plan, they had access to the guidance counselor who was essentially on call for the student the entire time the student was in the building. It got to be so much to manage that an IEP was developed and a case manager was put into place to help the student manage their anxiety. This teachers closely worked with the student ongoing on a daily basis to be sure the student received accommodations. The student was actually provided with specially designed instruction. So we're going to talk about the differences between specially designed instruction and a 504 plan, specially designed instruction is in an IEP, and accommodations are in a 504 plan. And in this case, specially designed instruction was provided to the student in the areas of stress management and study skills. So the student was actually given direct instruction on how to help manage their stress and also in areas of study skills. The hearing officer noted that one significant complicating factor assisting the student under both the 504 plan and the IEP was the students, and I'm going to quote, extreme sensitivity to being singled out in any way, even being called down to the guidance office. So that complicated the ability to be able to provide the services the student need, because the student was really resistant to them, which I think we often see with students with anxiety. So in this case, the hearing officer found that the district really did the best that it could, and those are the words she used. And oftentimes she felt that went well beyond what was reasonable. She also, though, noted that she is in awe of what the student accomplished and what the district and the mother did to help. Interestingly, I think what also probably factored into this is that student was the time that this hearing, the student had graduated from high school, and the parent filed for due process after the student had graduated. So the student was in college and doing relatively well in college. So I think that probably factored into the hearings officer's decision that he was able to overcome the disability to be able to attend college, and was actually doing relatively well in his first year. Panic disorder is another type of anxiety, the third type of anxiety, and this is unexpected or repeated episodes of intense fear accompanied by physical symptoms that may include chest pain, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, dizziness, or abdominal distress. So I think this is the anxiety that we would see more than some other anxieties where there might be some more subtle symptoms. So if a student has a panic attack, you're going to know that they're having a panic attack. You're going to see those actual physical symptoms. I often hear school districts sometimes say to me, we're not seeing the anxiety, or they'll tell the parents, we're not seeing the anxiety in school. We're not seeing the manifestation of anxiety. And I caution them to, take a look at some of the more subtle symptoms of anxiety, because you may not see a full-blown panic attack as you would with a panic disorder type of anxiety. So moving on to post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is another type of anxiety. And this can develop after exposure to a terrifying event or ordeal in which grave physical harm occurred or was threatened. Traumatic events that may trigger post-traumatic stress disorder include violent personal assaults, natural or human-caused disasters, accidents, or military combat. So in WP versus Upper Darby School District, in that case, this was a case where the student had suffered a traumatic incident in the summer prior to going into the school year. When the student began attending the school year, the student demonstrated a pattern of poor attendance and failing grades, and that continued, and that was unabated. It was across 4 marking periods. And as the hearing officer noted, it was without any investigation into whether the student was merely truant because the anxiety was impacting their ability to come to school, or whether the known incident, what happened to them over the summer, was adversely impacting the student's ability to access the educational environment. So in this case, the guidance counselor and the social worker, who were aware of the post-traumatic stress disorder in the student, who were aware of the incident and had expressed their concerns about the student's mental health, actually had only minimal contact with the student over the course of the entire school year. So the hearing officer found that in light of all of those circumstances, that by the end of the second marking period, and I think this brings into another factor when we talk about to a significant degree over a period of time, So the district had sufficient knowledge to take steps to discern basically that by the second marking period, when the students' grades were failing, consistently failing grades, and the attendance did not improve, that at that point, the hearing officer deemed the district should have suspected the student had a disability and evaluated the student and identified and started providing the appropriate accommodations and specially designed instruction that the student needed. So I think that when we look at that case, one thing to take note of is that obviously, again, we see that theme where the district is doing nothing to address it. And the hearing officer found that the district was liable, but also that at what point does the district have to or should be is obligated to say, okay, this is a disability, a suspected disability. So the hearing officer said that in this case that it was after 2 marking periods. So that was enough time to say, okay, this child is suffering and we need to do something about it. So the fifth type of anxiety is social phobia or social anxiety disorder. And this is an overwhelming anxiety and excessive self-consciousness in everyday social situations. So social phobia can be limited to only one type of situation, such as fear of speaking in formal or informal situations, eating or drinking in front of others, or in its most severe form, it may be so broad that a person experiences symptoms almost anytime they're around other people. So obviously, if a student is suffering from this is going to be challenging for them to attend in-person school. So in this case, in AW, um, in AW versus Middletown School District, in this case, the student was had attended a cyber charter school placement prior to actually returning to the middle school, the district's middle school. So they were out of the district and then came back into the district and had been in cyber instruction. So when they came back into the district that first year they came back, the student at that point wasn't according to the hearing officer, wasn't demonstrating any need. There was no, quote, red flag that would require the district to evaluate the student for either Section 504 or IDEA. The student's grades were passing and above. And yes, there were periods of time where the student's grades declined to an F in 1 or 2 subjects. The student was able to bring up those grades by the end of the year. The student's behavior was acceptable. There was only one incident where the student had disrespectful behavior, which resulted in was a suspension. But other than that, there were no other incidences. Now, the hearing officer did note that the student had absences that were far more than average for the student's peers, but that there was no indication of substantial deprivation of educational benefit. So the hearing officer found that it wasn't impacting the student educationally. So, again, I think the common theme is, are we seeing that significant impact, the adverse impact on educational performance, to a marked degree over a period of time? In this case, there really wasn't. The student was passing overall, was actually above average in a lot of areas. Maybe they dropped a little bit, but was able to bring it back up. The sixth type of anxiety is separation anxiety. This is a very specific fear or distress that can happen in both children and adults when they think they're separating from home or from the people they've become attached to. And then finally, the seventh type of anxiety, which is also probably less common, is selective mutism. And it's a complex childhood anxiety disorder. It's characterized by the child's inability to speak and communicate effectively in a school setting, or excuse me, in social settings such as school. these children are able to speak and communicate in settings where they're relaxed, comfortable, and secure. So this is an example of a student who, selective mutism, the student is maybe comfortable to talk to their family and their friends, but anyone they're not comfortable with, they're not comfortable communicating with. So it's a very specific area of anxiety, type of anxiety. So I want to talk about ways in which anxiety can manifest in school. And there's several slides on this. But before we get into them, I want to just talk about how important it is that, because this is, again, like I said, one of the things that I often hear, and I think parents often hear, is we're not seeing signs of anxiety in school. So I think it's really important to, number one, understand the numerous symptoms of anxiety and how it can manifest in school that maybe aren't so obvious, maybe are a little more subtle. And then two, I think it's really important for parents and guardians to document to the district or charter school how their child's anxiety manifests so they can make sure that the district is aware of what to keep an eye out for. And then, in additionally, documenting when their child is experiencing that anxiety. So if their child comes home from school and tells them about how in school they were feeling very anxious and what happened, maybe they went and hid in the bathroom for a little bit, maybe they went to the nurse's office, maybe they couldn't complete work, they were putting their head down, send an email, document that in writing to the school. I wanted to make you aware that, my son was demonstrating anxiety in school today. Here's what happened, and explain exactly what happened. It's it would it's always beneficial if a student themselves can express that they're feeling anxiety, but as we know with students with anxiety, that is not often the case, that they have a hard time coming, and that's, districts will almost expect, well, the child didn't tell us. Well, they're not going to, because that's part of their disability. So that's why it's real important for the parent to document that for the child and do that as it's happening. Don't wait until months down the road. Don't wait until, something significant happens. As the anxiety is happening in school, make sure you document it. Or even if the anxiety is happening at home, but it's related to school activities. So for example, if if your child's coming home and they have a lot of schoolwork to do and they're really struggling because they're very anxious about their schoolwork and their grades, that's something that you should let the put that in writing, document to the school district that my child is struggling, um, so that you make it clear to the district or charter school what's happening with your student. So now let's talk about ways that anxiety can manifest in school. Oh no, if we could go back, sorry, Roseanne. Thank you. So the ways that students' anxiety can manifest in school. Now, these lists are not exhaustive, clearly. I could probably go on, but these are some of the big ones that we often see. So students socially, when we have that social manifestation, the students who have anxiety may try to avoid tasks or environments that make them feel anxious. So avoiding socializing with peers, avoiding or not completing class presentations, avoiding group work in the classroom. Maybe they don't go to the cafeteria during lunch. Maybe they avoid gym class because that's a more social interaction. So these are just some things to look for. And again, if your student's demonstrating those, ask the district or the charter school to look for these. So the anxiety can manifest in school emotionally as well. Students with anxiety may have a difficult time understanding and appropriately expressing their emotions, as we just talked about. So you may see a flat effect. You may see irritability. It could come out in irritability, or you may see students that demonstrate behavioral difficulties because of it. Sadness, anger, withdrawal. That's why it's a more students that demonstrate concerns, whether it's anxiety or other, social, emotional, behavioral concerns, and it comes out, it's they're acting out behaviors, they tend to get more attention from school districts and charter schools. The student with anxiety that withdraws and takes it all in, and it's an internal thing that's happening with them, they don't get as much attention. And that's why it's really important for parents or guardians to be the voice of their child, and again, document it in writing, but be the voice of their child to say, my child's putting their head down. That means they're anxious. My child's, not playing with other peers. They're anxious. They're off by themselves. These are things that you need to be the voice for your child, especially when your child's internalizing that anxiety. So behaviorally, this is the more external manifestation of anxiety. Students that demonstrate anxiety with behavioral difficulties. Sometimes they're compulsively kicking their classmate's chair. Again, this list is not at all exhaustive. Throwing tantrums when there's unexpected changes, asking a lot of questions. I noticed this a lot. Students with anxiety will ask a lot of questions, and that's to help relieve their anxiety. But teachers might not really pick up on that. They might just think the child's inquisitive. But that's why I think it's real important for parents to make their staff aware that this is how my child's anxiety is manifesting. Aggressive behavior. So that fight or flight, that's the aggressive part. And then the child that's eloping, that's the flight. That could be anxiety, and that's why they're eloping from the situation. So that, I think that is the last slide on physically. And this is a big one. So anxiety can manifest in school physically as well. Students with anxiety may have physical reactions, frequent complaints of headaches, stomach aches, or other physical ailments. I know lots of students I've represented over the years. I always ask for nursing records because it's crazy how often students with anxiety will visit the nurse, and they're not going to say, I'm feeling anxious. They're going to say, I have a stomach ache, or I have a headache. Maybe even my arm's hurting. It comes out in these somatic complaints. Even a student that goes to the restroom a lot can also be that physical manifestation of anxiety. Again, they're avoiding the classroom, they're avoiding a social situation, they're trying to escape. Panic attacks, fast, heavy breathing, sweating problems, fast heart rate. Again, that's, a more obvious manifestation of a more physical, obvious manifestation of anxiety in a physical form, that I think those nurses' visits and complaints of the somatic symptoms or a more subtle indication. So anxiety preventing school attendance. This is a big one I want to talk about, just because, again, I think some hearing officers see it differently than others, and I think it might factor into what's happened, what the circumstances are. But students with anxiety may have difficulty even attending school at all. Sometimes they're frequently absent, sometimes they're frequently late, and sometimes they're frequently avoiding classes. But that not attending school at all. So, and I always say to districts, well, their anxiety is so severe that they're not even able to participate in the educational process. So then how do we then address that? As you saw in TH, as we heard about in TH, where the hearing officer found that that student was really not coming to school hardly at all, but the hearing officer didn't really even address whether the district needed to address the student's attendance issues, because the hearing officer in that case found that the IEP was so horrible that it wouldn't matter if the child came to school. Now in MS, this is a case where the anxiety was manifesting at home. The district was claiming that it was not manifesting in school. They were not seeing signs of that. Nonetheless, they did have an IEP for the student. They did not have specific IEP goals, but they did have in-school therapeutic supports, as well as they recommended home-based therapeutic supports. And I think this probably factored into it, because the family did not did not take that recommendation of getting those in-home therapeutic supports at home. And I think that factored into the hearing officer's decision. So I think it's real important to make sure that if your child does have anxiety and you're seeking the district to support and to help, that you're also seeking assistance from outside agencies as well that are available, especially when that anxiety is manifesting at home more so than in the school setting. So in this case, the hearing officer found the district was not liable, but again, the district was implementing an IEP that did include a variety of specially designed instruction and program modifications. So these included increased wait time for responses, assistance in making and checking aids, reviewing and clarifying directions, assistance in chunking and monitoring assignments, access to a clean copy of the teacher's notes, preview of vocabulary to accommodate for any kind of decoding issues, use of a calculator unless the math unit focused on learning to calculate, extended time was allowed, testing in a separate location was allowed, questions to be read out loud, a word bank that had a limited number of choices for fill in the blank, matching assignments with no more than 10 items, reduction from 3 to 4 choices on multiple questions, and formulas were provided to compute answers. So the district did provide a variety of accommodations to address that anxiety as well as other needs, it sounds like. But the other thing in this case that to point out is, so oftentimes we'll advocate that a student needs a functional behavior assessment when there's chronic attendance issues. So behavior of attendance is behavior, non-attendance is behavior. So we can do a functional behavior assessment to determine the function of that behavior and also to positively reinforce the student coming to school. So positively reinforce the appropriate behavior while determining what the function of the inappropriate behavior is. So in this case, the district, because of those chronic attendance issues, was not able to complete a functional behavior assessment in school. So the question then becomes, well, are they obligated to provide a functional behavior assessment in the home setting? Now, in this case, I think we can sort of implied that the hearing officer was saying, well, yeah, the district should complete a functional behavior assessment in the home setting under these circumstances. Unfortunately, in this case, as I mentioned before, the family was not willing to accept services in the home. So the family did not accept services in the home for this student, but also the district, the hearing officer noted that the district's not completing an FBA in the home setting was a reasonable thing to do in this case because the family had not cooperated with a counseling agency to work in the home setting regarding truancy issues for one of the student's siblings. So that was even taken into account. So the district was not held liable for not completing that FBA in the home because the hearing officer said, well, that was reasonable to believe that the parents wouldn't be receptive to an in-home FBA. And they did decide to do other measures and implement the IEP with all the things that we just mentioned. So IEP versus 504 plan. Students with anxiety may require an IEP if they require specially designed instruction. If their needs can be met with only accommodations, a 504 plan can be implemented. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between specially designed instruction and and accommodations. So the whole reason that students are identified under IDEA for essentially as a student eligible under the IDA, they need specially designed instruction, and that's why they get an IEP. So they need something different than what the regular education curriculum can provide, something specially designed. So for example, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but instruction in coping skills. So the student with anxiety doesn't have the proper coping skills, appropriate coping skills to manage their anxiety. That's not something that's taught in the typical regular education curriculum, so they need specially designed instruction to teach them coping skills. On the other hand, there's a 504 plan, which is merely accommodations. So that is when a student does not need specially designed instruction, but just needs accommodations to, and that's a lot of the things that we just talked about in the previous case were accommodations, copies of notes, access to the guidance counselor, extra time. Those are accommodations. So in DP versus North Pocono School District, in this case, the curriculum, the hearing officer found that yes, because the curriculum needed to be adapted to explicitly teach the student skills to cope better. So to teach the student coping skills, that that they would need that they would need an IEP, that they would be eligible for an IEP. The student also needed instruction in organizational skills and self-regulation skills to internally address the anxiety. So in this case, the hearing officer found that yes, the student needed specially designed instruction and therefore needed an IEP. The other thing, oh, before we move on, the other thing I wanted to mention, you can keep this slide here, but the other thing I wanted to mention with this case is that regarding a functional behavior assessment. So we talked about functional behavior assessments in terms of assessing the student's ability to attend school. So in this case, the hearing officer mentions that when we're talking about a student transitioning, so a transition plan, that we would want to do a functional behavior assessment of the student's decisions about non-attendance to identify the functions of such behavior and assist in planning a positive behavior support plan so that the student can choose increasingly, basically make good choices to come to school. So in this case, again, I think it's important to note that hearing officers do encourage the use of functional behavior assessments for students that are having those attendance issues. So IEPs for counseling, what would go into an IEP for, or excuse me, for anxiety? Counseling services is if a student needs to learn how to recognize their anxiety and to appropriately cope with that anxiety, so the teaching of coping skills, that's a counseling service. It could be a related service, but the specially designed instruction is the actual teaching of those coping skills. Social skills instruction, being able to learn appropriate ways to interact with their peers, to relieve that anxiety and be able to socialize with their peers in a healthy way. So that's an area again of specially designed instruction. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. Behavioral services to help students learn how to appropriate ways to cope with their anxiety. So if you have a student that, like we mentioned before, is having those externalizing symptoms of anxieties, manifestations of anxiety, where they're demonstrating behavioral challenges, you would want to have services to help the student learn, again, that specially designed instruction to learn ways to cope with their anxiety. Any accommodation that would be in a 504 plan could also be in an IEP as well. So we're going to talk about those when we get to the next couple slides. So before we move on to 504 accommodations, IEPs for anxiety, one thing I think is really important to mention, because I often hear this a lot in my discussions with school districts and during IEP meetings, are goals needed to address the anxiety when there's a related service or specially designed instruction. So for example, I have this where school districts will say to me, well, they're offering counseling services, or they're offering social skills instruction. And I say, okay, well, where are the goals? Where are the goals for the social skills? Where are the goals for the coping skills, the goals to address the anxiety? And they'll say, well, we don't need goals. because we have the services. And I said, well, then how are you monitoring the progress in the student? So there's a case called WR versus Western Wayne School District, where the hearing officer hit this right on the head. It's great language here. This is what the hearing officer says, that the IEP team, without baseline data, added social work services as a related service. So social work services, again, counseling services, they're all essentially providing those services to a student. So the district added social work services into the student's IEP, but did not include a goal or statement why the social work services were otherwise necessary. The hearing officer said that the IEP team cannot reasonably calculate or determine the appropriate frequency, intensity, location, or duration of services without a comprehensive evaluation or objective present levels. So we need to have a baseline. And then the hearing officer says the IEP cannot accurately measure progress without a present level and measurable goals. So I think that makes it pretty clear that we should have goals. 504 plans for anxiety. So here are some, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but here are some accommodations that I found tend to be helpful for students with anxiety. And these, again, can also go into the IEP. So if you have a student that has an IEP and is receiving counseling services and social work services or social skills instruction, you can also have these accommodations in their IEP as well. So 504 plan for anxiety may include permitted to present to teacher instead of class. So if they have to do a class presentation, that's very anxiety producing for a student with anxiety. So giving them the accommodation that you can present it to just me, that you don't have to present it to the class. Permitted to work alone instead of groups. That group work, can be a real source of anxiety for the student. So allowing them to work by themselves, allowing them to come in late, permitted to leave class, permitted to eat lunch in another environment. The cafeteria may be too anxiety producing for them. Permitted to obtain physical education requirements outside of a school setting. So I have a lot of students with anxiety that have really struggled with PE, with physical education, and that's a real source of anxiety for them. So sometimes we're able to obtain where they can get their physical education requirements by doing something outside of school and presenting that to the district. So potential problems with accommodations without specially designed instruction. So all those things we just talked about in a 504 plan, I think can be really good for a student to have those accommodations when needed. But here's some of the concerns with just having accommodations and not having specially designed instruction to go along with those accommodations. So number one, does the student need to be taught how to recognize anxiety? If they do, they need specially designed instruction. They need that instruction to help them. There's a great program called Zones of Regulation that helps the student recognize areas of, emotional regulation and recognizing anxiety as part of that. Does the student need to be taught appropriate coping skills? Are they anxious and they don't know how to cope with that? Yes, then they would need specially designed instruction. Does the student need to be taught appropriate social skills? Because social skills and anxiety go hand in hand. And again, does the student need to be taught appropriate behaviors? Because if the student's demonstrating behaviors as a manifestation of their anxiety, these are, again, we want to have that specially designed instruction so we're actually teaching them the skills they need. And then finally, and I think about this a lot, aren't we just reinforcing school avoidance with accommodations only? So, if we look at that last slide that we have where we have all these accommodations that again can be needed and helpful, beneficial to the student, but if we only do them, so yes, we let the kid leave class early, or they don't have to attend physical education and they don't have to present to their teacher, but and we're not teaching them the skills to help cope with their anxiety, in the long run, that student's not really learning the skills to help manage their anxiety. So we're essentially just kind of reinforcing that school avoidance, that social avoidance. And I often have this discussion not only with school districts, because it does come into play. Sometimes school districts say, well, the student only needs a 504 plan. And I'll make this argument that why it's so important to have that specially designed instruction. So we're helping that student to become more successful. So we're helping them learn how to deal with their anxiety so that they can then address it. If But I sometimes have to have the same conversation with parents, because I do have some parents that, yes, and I get it, they want their child to be safe and know that they're not, having all sorts of internal or anxiety going on and really struggling. So we want to put these accommodations in place. And that's, again, that's fine and that's all good. But we want to make sure we also are teaching those skills so that we're helping that student, because we don't want, and I've seen it happen, we don't want a student to just be accommodated all the way through school. And then by the time they finish school, they're not able to socially interact with their peers. They're not able to cope with things, things that happen that aren't expected. So how are they going to, you know, get a job or go to college or whatever their post-secondary goals may be? Are there limits on district responsibility? So does the school district have to address students' anxiety who's not attending school? So we'll go back to this a little bit. Again, we saw what MS said with the hearing officer, and MS said that, and again, I think that had a lot to do with the family's unwillingness to accept outside services. But in that case, the hearing officer, the attendance issues were addressed through the specially designed instruction and accommodations, and the hearing officer did not find the district's not addressing the attendance issues itself as a denial of faith. Whereas, contrast that with TH, where in that case, the hearing officer says that, and again, this was the case where the district said, well, he's not coming to school. There's nothing we can do. The problem for the district, the hearing officer says, is that in identifying the student's anxiety as the primary basis for IDA eligibility and the underlying reason for the student's limited at school attendance, the district had the obligation to effectively address that issue. So I think it's real important that if you have a student who is not coming to school or has attendance issues because, or not attending class, even coming late to school, that if it's related to anxiety, that be well documented and you push for that to be the basis of their IDA eligibility. Okay. Do school districts have to address students' anxiety if they are not diagnosed with a psychological diagnosis? This comes off often as well. School districts will tell parents, well, you need to go get a psychological diagnosis of anxiety disorder. That is not true. You do not need to get a psychological diagnosis. If anxiety is manifesting in school, again, the emotional disturbance and the other health impairment eligibility categories that we discussed early on in the presentation, there's no the district does not have to have a psychological diagnosis to determine a student is eligible under emotional disturbance or other health impairment. The requirements are what they are. So when we went through the emotional disturbance and we went through those factors, if the student is meeting any of those factors and it's adversely impacting their educational performance to a significant over a significant period of time and to a marked degree, then there's no requirement for a psychological diagnosis. Same with other health impairment. However, it can't hurt if you're able to get a psychological diagnosis and your child isn't diagnosed with anxiety disorder, any one of the anxiety disorders that we went through, the types of anxiety disorders, it cannot hurt, and it certainly can be helpful. Do school districts have to address students' anxiety if they are achieving expected academic standards? So I don't know exactly. I argue that it depends on how they're functioning otherwise. Again, it's not just academics. Education is not just academics. But in GD versus Westchester School District, the hearing officer found that the student did not exhibit anxiety in school to a marked degree or in such a way to adversely affect the student's performance, because the hearing officer found that the student performed at a high level, both socially and academically. So it certainly, the hearing officer in that case looked at how the student was performing academically, but socially as well. And in that case, it seemed like the student was performing at high levels, according to the hearing officer. Truancy and anxiety. So thankfully I see this less than I used to years ago, and I think it has a lot to do with reforms in Pennsylvania truancy law that's really slowed down that punitive measure that school districts used to immediately file for truancy when a student was not coming to school. It didn't matter what the reason was. But now they've implemented some new law that provides that they have to do a lot more before they just go ahead and file for truancy. So, but school districts still need to be very sensitive to absenteeism due to anxiety. It's not a truant behavior. A student that's anxious and not coming to school, it's not because they're a truly truant student is a student that's just saying, I'm not coming to school. And it's not because of some disability such as anxiety. So in TQ, the hearing officer actually found that the district's use of truancy exacerbated the underlying causes of the students' absenteeism, and found that it was a denial of free appropriate public education. So I think it's, that's not the way to go. School districts should not be filing for truancy for students with anxiety. So I'm going to answer questions, but I want to thank everyone and just mention that I'm here. If you prefer to contact me at a different time, you feel free to reach out. These are our telephone numbers. I can also put my email in the chat. I will do that for everyone. But we do take many cases at no cost to parents. So I think that's important to note that we're here to help.